You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 128. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. During today's episode, we're going to dig into what drives you as a writer. Is it something internal or something outside of you? Neither is right or wrong because all of us are different. However, research has shown that internal or intrinsic drivers take us farther and result in more satisfying payoffs when we reach our goals. Researchers Edward Deci and Richard Ryan wrote in a 2000 article for American Psychologist that, quote, comparisons between people whose motivation is authentic, literally self-authored or endorsed, and those who are merely externally controlled for an action typically reveal that the former, relative to the latter, have more interest, excitement, and confidence, which in turn is manifest both as enhanced performance, persistence, and creativity, end quote. And you can find a link to that paper in the description of this episode. What this means is that people who are primarily driven by internal motivators tend to find enjoyment in the actual work of the process, because the payoff happens along the way, rather than at the end, which is working toward a reward. However, I would argue that people who are primarily driven by external motivators tend to find enjoyment in the social aspect of the process, aka the accountability conversation or the rewards that come at specific points along the way. Gretchen Rubin, author of The Four Tendencies, talks about this for people who identify as obligers, who are people who are more likely to do something because another person is relying on them or expects them to complete the thing. The example she provides is of a runner who had no trouble showing up to practice in college, but struggled to maintain the running habit after graduation. The key for her was showing up to a group of other people who expected her to be there. There's nothing wrong with being driven by external or extrinsic motivators like a publishing deal, financial goals, or being recognized for your writing. But think about this. When those things happen, what's the next thing to shoot for? Sometimes people can find themselves quote-unquote at the top and yet have no motivation to keep going after they reach that point because it feels like they've peaked. People with internal drivers are less likely to have that problem. And I'll give you an example. So when I published Mark of Stars, which is book 1 in my fantasy series, I held it in my hands for about 5 minutes with pure delight, and then I set it down on the desk and wondered what was next for book 2. While I 100% enjoyed the fact that I got the book done, I was almost immediately on to the next one because I have a story inside me that is dying to get out, even if it takes a while to tell it the right way. Here's looking at you, book 3. So here's the question. Why do people rely on external or extrinsic motivators to write? I'd argue that part of it comes down to your personality, but it's also a very powerful psychological boost to receive praise from other people or to be accountable to another person in order to finish your work. I love hearing feedback on my stories, and my favorite part of the writing process are my editing review calls with Haley, but those are not my primary drives to write. And this also relates to deadlines. If you find deadlines more stress-inducing than motivating, you might have more intrinsic drivers. So in practice, how does this look with writing? Intrinsic drivers can include a feeling of satisfaction for hitting a word count or another writing goal, writing in honor of someone else, maybe a memory, a tribute, or a memorial, proving to yourself that you can do it. And this is sometimes triggered by external words, aka someone said that you can't or you shouldn't, but then that drive morphs into self-satisfaction for your personal improvement over time. I see this a lot in the premium groups. Another one is wanting to write just because you want to, and it really doesn't need to be more complicated than that. And it's also the unquenchable need to tell the story that's living in your head. And this is me. As for the external drivers, and again, these are not all-inclusive or an exhaustive list, there are plenty of others, but extrinsic drivers can include the potential for monetary success or public accolades and awards. It can be an accountability agreement with another person, and this works better when you're both equally invested in that relationship. It can also be showing up to a group like Premium, knowing that you'll be asked to share a win or progress on your goals. It's the promise of a reward to reach a word count, a chapter milestone, or even a stage milestone, like if you're at the editing stage or the formatting stage, things like that. And rewards can be anything from a dinner out or a shopping spree at the bookstore, a guilt-free candy bar, all the way up to a weekend trip or something even more extravagant, depending on what kind of rewards motivate you and the value of that reward in relation to the milestone that you hit. And then another one could even be entering your work into a writing contest. So the last thing that I want to touch on for this episode is how to figure out which is your primary motivation. You're not one or the other 100%. There are times that we are driven by external things, even if our primary motivator is internal, and vice versa. To figure out your primary motivation for writing, take a few minutes to reflect on why you write at all. What's the reason? What made you decide one day to write the story that you're writing? Now, I wouldn't be surprised that most writers are actually intrinsically motivated, but there are probably several of you listening who really are doing it for the possibility of praise. And again, there is nothing wrong with that. If you want to tap into the opposite motivator from your primary, feel free to take an example from the lists in this episode and just try it out. If you're primarily an intrinsic, but you want to test out extrinsic, set milestone rewards for yourself and then actually take them. This is admittedly the hardest one for me because I'm not a celebration type person, but I will tell you, it was quite gratifying to go out to dinner with my husband after I finished the rewrite of book 3 and sent it to Haley and my beta readers. And if you're primarily an extrinsic, but you want to test out intrinsic, consider going into writing sessions without a word count or page goals, or even a direction in mind for the writing. Just write. See what comes out and see how you feel about it. I think we do need both types of motivators in our lives. It's just a matter of knowing what works for each of us and curating a list of things that will get us typing during writing time. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me, and remember, the first draft is supposed to be garbage. Thanks for listening to the Novel Writing Podcast. If you're ready to stop struggling and start finishing your novel, check out the 60-Day Novel Writing Challenge. It's a step-by-step program designed for solo writers to complete their first draft with clarity and focus. Visit the link in the description to learn more.